Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. This is set in the Dust Bowl around the 1930s to 1936. So one of the things that we need to be aware of is that the Dust Bowl takes place roughly about the same time as the Great Depression. So this is something that Steinbeck is using within the story to set up the scene to help us understand the dynamics between people. One of the things we're going to be taking a look at is the dynamics between particularly husbands and wives as well as farmers and bankers. These are some of the things that are going to be reoccurring throughout the story. So one of the things I wanted to focus on specifically in this is it's actually setting up the scene for the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl is something that happened, like I said earlier, in the 1930s to 1936, where there was a lot of dust because of poor agricultural practices. So let's get into the story. As always, I will be only taking a look at a fraction of the story, so please take a look at it for yourself. I will be linking it in the description below. In the roads where the teams moved, where the wheels milled the ground and the hooves of the horses beat the ground, the dirt crust broke and the dust formed. Every moving thing lifted the dust into the air. The walking man lifted a thin layer as high as his waist, and a wagon lifted the dust as high as the fence tops. An automobile boiled in a cloud behind it. The dust was long in settling back again. Here we have a scene where we're setting a description, and dust is that primary focus, that recurring theme, particularly in the first chapter. That's something that keeps on popping up again and again and again. As they talk about it earlier, they talk about hooves and plows. So what this indicates to us is the fact that plows are driven not necessarily by tractors, but rather by horses. Now, one of the upsides of horses is that you don't necessarily have to buy the gasoline for it. You don't have to pay for the fixed repairs. But the downside is, and it's a major downside, is the fact compared to tractors can go a lot further, a lot faster, and can pull a lot more weight at a much reduced cost. The automobile is something that came about prior to World War I. So this is something that we are just beginning to see implemented in the agricultural business. One of the things they talk about in the story is the fact that you have a character who says, if you have a plot of land, you need a tractor to plow it. Plowing is one of those things that you have to do on a land to make it usable for crops. For us, we are so used to the large vehicles that we see every day when it comes to making our food. Back then, they didn't have that ability to plow as easily as possible. In addition, the amount of food per square foot is actually significantly reduced compared to what we see today. Whereas what we could get today, we could have food that would last a family of 4 a couple of weeks off of here would only be able to be sustained for a couple of days. These are some of the things that we have to be aware of when we're talking about setting up our scene. Where does the technology set to? Is the technology to the point where they are able to provide food for themselves in addition to everything else? I've talked about this before when we talk about farming. Are we allowing for situations in our story where the farmers are able to grow more than what they need? When they're able to grow more than what they need, they can sell it off. But here we're talking about particularly dust and how dust covers everything. It is almost character in of itself, the fact that we see dust popping up again and again and again in the first chapter. The wind grew stronger, the rain crust broke, and the dust lifted off the fields and drove gray plumes into the air like sluggish smoke. The corn threstled in the wind made a dry rushing sound. The finest dust did not settle back on the earth, but disappeared into the darkening sky. Here we have an image of the fact that the horrors that are taking place in the Midwest, where the Dust Bowl took place, it is not just something that's affecting this particular area, but rather it's disappearing into the darkening sky. It is leaving. It is beginning to affect the world around them. That's kind of what he's saying here when he writes this sentence is that what's going on here has ramifications throughout the nation, if not the world. So these are some of the ways that we can tell in our stories how things are going to play out later, or how things are affecting other places. Men and women huddled in their houses. They tied handkerchiefs over their noses when they went out and wore goggles to protect their eyes. Here we're showing a deeper impact that the dust is having on the individuals. Here we're showing a deeper impact on how they have to protect themselves from the horrors that is the Dust Bowl. Faults that they partially probably created, but they didn't understand. So they have to protect themselves against the dust. And if we take the idea of dust as being the bad ideas or the bad plans that we put out that don't work out, these are some of the things that people are doing to protect themselves. They wear handkerchiefs over their noses and goggles in their eyes, making sure that they're able to do their job. Later, there's a scene where you have a man on a tractor. He has to have a mask and goggles, like stated here, in order to plow. We're talking a lot of dust. Now, one of the reasons why there was a lot of dust is because the way that they were using agriculture to try and produce as much crops as possible was actually causing erosional effects. Erosion caused by wind. This is where the dust comes from. When the night came again, it was black night, for the stars could not pierce the dust that could get down, and the window lights could not even spread beyond their own yards. Here we're setting a scene where the majesty of the stars above, one of the things that we in the more modern age take for granted is that light pollution is quite common. We actually don't see a lot of the stars at night, depending on where we live. If we're living in some place like New York or somewhere near a city, so we're not necessarily going to see the stars as we would somewhere else, like in the middle of the ocean. So what he's showing here is the fact that you have the majesty of the stars are unable to pierce the dust. Like I said earlier, the dust might be a symbolization of the bad ideas and the horrors of what mankind has been doing to the earth. So in addition, by window lights could not even spread beyond their own yards, what we're showing here is the fact that you have, when they say window lights are not even being able to spread beyond their own yards, the happiness and the joy that is between families, between communities, is unable to actually be connected with each other because of this dust, because of these ideas, because of what's going on in the world at the time. These are some of the things that that he is showing in this story. And the women came out of the house to stand beside their men to feel whether this time the men would break. What he's showing here is actually the consequences that this is affecting on the men in the women's lives. This is shown more from the woman's perspective. But what's going on here is that you're showing men dealing with the consequences of their crops failing, of different things that are going on, how the men are taking this. Men generally are the ones that are able to hand up to stress and pressures. Women rely on that. Particularly in this time, men were providers, women were builders of the houses. They were the raisers of the children. These were part and parcel of the times that they were living. So when the women are trying to create a home, the men are trying to provide. Men are taking this very seriously at the time, just like the women took their role very seriously. Obviously, things have changed, whether for good or ill. But at the time, this is the situation that they were living in. Men stood by their fences and looked at the ruined corn, drying fast now, only a little green showing through the film of dust. The men were silent. They did not move often. Here, what we're seeing is a situation where the man has been putting in effort and energy and emotional time into creating food for himself and his family. But what ends up being is that the consequences of reality are drying out the corn. They are causing the food, the future that he was building towards, to die. This is where you are struggling with, as a man, trying to build up something for your family, the people that you love. Women and children drew in themselves that no misfortune was too great to bear if their men were whole. Here we're giving us imagery of the fact that as long as the men had hope, as long as there was an idea that he could figure out what was going on, as long as he could figure out how things were going to play out for the benefit of his family, that the women and children had faith in that man, that they were able to see, because if the women and children didn't necessarily know or couldn't necessarily see for themselves, the men were able to look beyond and try and figure out how to save their family. This is another heroic idea that we've talked about previously. These are some of the ways that we can show these things. Here we're going to not necessarily a scene, but we're showing a little bit about how a scene is set up for a particular person, a new person that is in the story. The man's clothes were new, all of them, cheap and new. His gray cap was so new that the visor was still stiff and the button still on. Here we're giving a snapshot of a foreshadowing, as it were, of what this man is coming from. He's not somebody that has had a lot of experience in these clothes, which means that he got them recently. Now, the fact that they use the word cheap means is that he didn't necessarily buy them at a place or a place that was expensive. So him having all new clothes means that he had to get them somewhere where they were giving them out, where it wasn't cost effective for them to give them good clothes. Not shapeless and bulged as it would have been had it served for a while in all the various purposes of a cap, carrying a sack, a towel, handkerchief. Here, we're also given an indication of the type of persons that were common in this area, where the purpose of the cap was not necessarily just to protect somebody's head from the sun, but it also served a purpose of a carrying tool, carrying sack, towel, handkerchief, things that are small, that are compact, that you don't necessarily want to have in your pocket because it might cause a bulge, it might make it uncomfortable to walk. So they would use their cap as a way of carrying things. These are some of the things that you're adding on to your story, not necessarily in your first draft, but later on in your second, third, or fourth draft. Things that you are giving flavor to your story, giving flavor to your world. Casey took a bottle and regarding it broodingly. I ain't preaching no more. The spirit ain't in the people much no more. And worse than that, the spirit ain't in me no more. Here we're seeing somebody who, that character that we met earlier, he's meeting up with somebody, Casey, who was a former preacher, somebody who was a revivalist, that was somebody who lived their life trying to share what they believed with the gospel of the good news. Part of the problem is that what you end up finding out is that he wasn't living the life as was expected of him. And instead of being somebody who repented of it, he would just say, I'm sorry, and do it again. Somebody who wasn't actually allowing his beliefs to actually affect his life. That's one of the things about beliefs, is if it's not affecting your life, then you're doing something wrong. That's the reality of life. If you know a stove is hot, if you've touched it and you know it's hot, you're not going to touch it again unless there's something wrong, unless there's a reason to do it, unless you have some sort of desire to do it. Nearly every single person will never touch a hot stove after they've touched it once before. So, one of the things that we are shown here is the fact that you have a man who is part of the issues of the world. He is not necessarily somebody who is doing something wrong in the way that a lot of people would say that he's doing something wrong. But the fact is that he is acting out his life in a way that is not congruent with how he told everybody else to live. Of course, now and again, the spirit moving around, I rip out a meeting, or when folks send out food, I give them a grace, but my heart ain't in it. I only do it because they expect it. Here is a continuation of the idea that he is not a man who actually gets what he's supposed to be doing. He's not living his life according to the creed that he's been putting out. Here he says, my heart ain't in it. There's only so often that you can actually tell a lie, not necessarily a lie that is untruth, but rather a lie that isn't congruent with how you are living yourself, how you're not actually doing what you expected to do. I only do it because they expect it. He's allowing the pressures of society to tell him that he should be doing something even though he doesn't fully believe what he should be doing. This is a character that you see particularly early on in the story of how he is not necessarily somebody who is a hopeful creature, but rather somebody who's the cares of this world, the temptations of reality, the temptations of what's going on in the world, the not necessarily debauchery in the way that we would think it, but the faithlessness of somebody who is living their life according to their own desires. Here, we're given a little bit of a glimpse about how other people are living their life at the time, particularly kids. Every kid got a turtle at some time or another. Nobody can keep a turtle, though. They work at it, and last one day they get out and go away off somewheres. It's like me. This is the character that we met earlier with the new clothes. We found out later in the story that he actually did some time in prison. Here, he's taking this idea of every kid has a turtle, somebody who is living their life the way that they're supposed to. They're doing everything the way that they're supposed to, but end up one day they just fall off of it. Sort of like the idea of a alcoholic falling off the wagon. You do things for so long, if there's not actual real change in the person, then it's not something that actually lasts. It's not something that actually goes and sticks with the person. I wouldn't take the good old gospel just laying there in my hand. I got picking at it and working at it until I tore it all down. Here I got the Spirit sometime, ain't nothing to preach about. I got the call to lead people and no place to lead them. Here's one of the downsides of somebody who is taking a look at their belief system and pulling it apart and taking out the things that they don't like. This is something that doesn't necessarily have to do with religion, but other parts of our lives when we try to dissect and try to intelligize what we believe and we just think in our own way how we should be feeling or how we should be believing, what ends up happening is that our brains are finite. Our brains have inability to keep things in order. Having a structure that you have faith in, and everybody has faith. Don't anybody who tells you otherwise, you always have faith in something, whether it is your faith in yourself or whether it's a faith in something else. For me, I'm a Christian, so I have faith in the Bible. I have faith in God. I have faith in Jesus. For me, that's my standard. That's how I filter my life. Now, this means that I don't necessarily partake in things that non-Christians partake in. But then again, if I'm living my life in the way that I'm supposed to, I'm going to circumvent a lot of the problems that other people are going to suffer. This is the same thing here. When he talks about, I kept on picking at it and working at it until I tore it all down. Here, he was relying on himself. He was relying on his own intelligence, his own feelings, his own perception of reality, and he was picking apart what the good old gospel was and what he ended up having, sort of like if you have a castle made out of Legos. He was pulling off the Legos bit by bit, and when he finally was done, he realized that all he had was a pile of Legos. Gone was the image, or gone was the scene that was originally what the Legos made up. But because he didn't like things, because he took apart, he created nothing. He destroyed. He wasn't able to build back up to what he actually believed in. Where shall we go? The woman asked. We don't know. We don't know. The woman went quickly and quietly into the house. She herded the children ahead of them. Here we see the desperation and the end result of the dust, the horrors of reality at the time and why things weren't working out the way they were. Basically, you have men, their only option is if things aren't working here, you can only bang your head against the wall so many times before you realize that you have to leave, before you have to go somewhere else. So, the women, they want to know what the future holds in this scene. Obviously, that's not always going to be the case. These are more generalities than actual indications. Just because one person feels one way, another person feels the other way, that doesn't mean that that's always going to be, that any story is going to be wrong if it talks about generalities. Here, the women need to have security. Here we see the women need to have some sort of idea that Like we mentioned earlier in this story, the men need to know what's going on. When they show the signs of not knowing what's going on, they start to question, where shall we go? They knew that a man so hurt and so perplexed may turn to anger, even on the people he loves. They left the men alone to figure out and wander in the dust. Here's a realization that one of the problems when a man shoulders the responsibility for caring for a family, when things aren't working the way that they're supposed to, a lot of the time men turn to anger because that is the only emotion that society will allow them to feel. And one of the problems with that is obviously is that they snap at people that they love. Doesn't mean that they don't love them when they snap at them, but we have to realize is that when we put people in certain avenues, we can't be surprised when they lash out in certain ways. If we allow men to be more expressive sometimes, not necessarily saying that men should be overexpressive or that they should let their emotions rule over their lives, but having a place that the men could unload, having friends, having other male people in their lives, these are some of the things that men should be able to do to help them understand and help them grasp the situation that's going on around them. Property is the man, stronger than he is, and he is small, not big. Only his possessions are big, and he is a servant to his property. That is so, too. Here, we get this idea that sometimes what ends up happening is that our possessions own us. We allow the things that we own to own us. We allow the things that we hold on to, the things we put our faith in, to start having control of our lives. Sometimes that's a good thing. Having something bigger than ourselves allows us to put ourselves in perspective. But when they are things that cannot give back to us, when they are things that cannot give us what we need, we tend to lash out. We tend to feel trapped. These are all some of the things that we could tell in our story. So in the end, there are many different ways of telling the story. There's many different ways of putting this into perspective so that our story is something that has deep connections with our readers. And having those connections, having different ways of telling the same thing, can layer on meaning into our stories. All right, everybody, that's all I had for today. As always, I will be linking the title in the description below. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave it in the comment section below. Until next time, bye. I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe. Yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.